The body came down the Milliner's back steps at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in November, and Seren Gault, who made hats for a living and kept her accounts by candlelight after her daughter was in bed, watched from the workroom window as a man in a dark coat dragged another man by the collar across the wet flagstones of the alley behind Elgin Street and left him propped against the stone wall of the dye house opposite, then walked away into the fog without looking back. She counted to 30. She had learned to count before she moved. Her father, who had been a constable in Halifax before the drink took him, had told her that. Count before you move. The world changes while you count. The man against the wall did not move. She put down her needle. The back door of the millinery stuck in November the way it always did when the damp came off the harbour and worked its way into the frame. She put her shoulder into it. The cold came at her immediately, the particular wet cold of Halifax in late autumn that settled into the wool of your coat before you'd taken 3 steps. He was not dead. She knew before she reached him. Dead men didn't hold their shoulders the way he was holding his, braced against the stone, even unconscious, the way a man holds himself when some part of him is still trying to stay upright. She did not know then that he was Callum Devereux, the 5th Earl of Ashmore, or that the man who had left him in the alley had done so on the instruction of a woman who had already killed once and had intended for the damp November air and the laudanum in his flask to finish what she had started. She knew only that his lips had gone the colour of the November sky, and that if she left him against that wall, he would not be warm by morning. She went back inside for the rope she used to bundle deliveries. She looped it under his arms the way her father had shown her to move a man who could not be carried. He was large. She was not. What she had were the forearms of someone who had spent 11 years cutting buckram and wire and sizing and pulling hat blocks from the steam press. She got him to the back step in 3 pulls. She got him through the door in 2 more. She kicked the door shut behind them and turned the bolt and stood with her back against it and listened to the alley. No footsteps, no voices. The fog muffled everything. She let her breath out. By the workroom lamp, she could see him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 past it. His coat was fine wool, the kind she handled in the shop, only when she was trimming ladies' walking suits for the Barrington Street families. His boots were not the boots of a man who had walked far in them. Someone had gone through his coat pockets. They gaped at the edges the way pockets did when a hand had been in them recently and in a hurry. His watch chain was gone. His cufflinks were gone. But inside the breast pocket, caught in the lining where the seam had pulled slightly away from the facing, was a small card case of plain horn. She did not touch it yet. What was on his breath was not only spirits. She had grown up in a house where spirits were a daily item, and she knew the smell of them in all their varieties. This was something underneath the spirits, thin and sweet and not quite right, the way certain millinery adhesives smelled when you heated them past the point they were meant to go. Her daughter slept upstairs. She always slept through the sounds of the workroom. Nell was 9 and the daughter of a man who had died 4 years ago of a fever, and she had grown up with the workroom sounds the way other children grew up with the sound of a clock. It was the sound of the house working, and it meant safety, and it meant her mother was there. Seren got him off the flagstones and onto the cutting table, which was the flattest surface in the workroom and the sturdiest, because she needed both. He was heavy in the way that unconscious men were always heavy, the weight distributed entirely wrong. She got a length of clean flannel from the pressing shelf and folded it under his head. She put her fingers to the side of his throat. The pulse was there, slow and not well, but it was there. She sat on the cutting stool and looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the card case from his breast pocket. Inside there was a single card, cream, with a name engraved in a small and orderly script. C. Devereux, Ashmore. No address, no given name. The kind of card a man carried when the name alone was meant to do the work. She set the card case on the pressing shelf beside the flannel roll. She thought about the man in the dark coat. She thought about the methodical way he had walked away. She thought about the flask which she had found in the outer pocket of the man's coat, and which smelled of the same thin, sweet wrongness as his breath. She thought about her father's voice saying, "Count before you move," and she thought about Nell asleep upstairs, and she thought about the card that said Ashmore. Then she filled the kettle and put it on the stove, because whatever came next, it would come better with hot water and a clear head. And those were the two things she knew how to produce. The fever came up in him before 2 in the morning. She had expected it. The flask had gone into the alley, because she was not keeping it in the house, and she had gotten 2 cups of water into him by tipping his head forward over the cutting table and going slowly. He had not opened his eyes. He had said a word once, low and indistinct. She had thought it was a name. She had not been able to make it out. The fever made him restless in a way that the deep stillness of before had not. He moved on the cutting table, turning his head, his hands closing on nothing. She put a cool cloth on his forehead and held it there, and he went somewhat quieter, the way her daughter had gone quiet, under a cool cloth at 7 years old, when the croup had come on bad enough to frighten them both. She changed the cloth every quarter hour until dawn. Nell came downstairs at 6, the way she always did, in her stockings and her pinafore with her hair down, because she had not yet learned to do her own buttons at the back and was still waiting for her mother. She came around the cutting table partition and stopped. She looked at the man on the table. She looked at her mother. She said, "Is he dead?" She said, "No." Nell considered this. She was a practical child in the way that children of practical mothers sometimes were. She said, "Is he going to be dead?" Seren said, "I don't intend to let him." Nell nodded slowly. She said, "His coat is very good." Seren said, "I know." Nell pulled the stool to the far end of the cutting table, the end away from his head, and climbed up and sat with her feet dangling and watched him with the steady attention she gave to most things she had not encountered before. She did not touch him. She did not ask again whether he would die. She reached over after a while and straightened the flannel under his head, with 2 careful fingers, the way she had seen her mother do it, and then put her hands back in her lap and went on watching. Seren watched her daughter watch the stranger on the table, and felt the particular fear that came with being the only thing standing between a child and the world. She went to put the kettle on. He opened his eyes on the second morning. He opened them and looked at the ceiling of the millinery workroom, which was low and plastered, and had a water stain near the chimney breast in the rough shape of a calling bird, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he turned his head and saw Seren at the pressing bench. His eyes were brown. She had not been able to tell from the closed lids. He said, "Where is this?" His voice was a gentleman's voice, educated, a little rough from the fever. He said it the way men said things when they were not yet sure the world around them was reliable. She set down the brim wire she was working and came to stand at the end of the cutting table and looked at him. She said, "A millinery workroom on Elgin Street in Halifax. You were left in the alley behind this building on Tuesday night. It is Thursday morning." He closed his eyes. He was quiet long enough that she thought he had gone back under. Then he said, "My name is Callum Devereux. I apologise for the imposition." She said, "Your card says Ashmore." He opened his eyes again and looked at her in a way that was measuring without being unkind. She said, "I'm not going to put you out. I'm going to ask you what was in the flask." He let his breath go slowly. He said, "Bourbon, I thought, something else in it." She said, "Chloral, I'd say, from the smell of you when I found you, the kind they use to put foundry horses down." He looked at her with a new attention. He said, "You know the smell of chloral?" She said, "I've been making hats in this city for 11 years, and I've been buying sizing chemicals since the week I opened the shop. I know the smell of most things that aren't meant to be swallowed." He thought about that. Then he said, "There was a man," she said, "dark coat." He walked back down the alley toward Granville Street when he'd finished. He didn't look back. He closed his eyes again. After a moment he said, "I would be grateful if you didn't send for anyone until I've had a moment to understand what I've told you." She said, "I haven't sent for anyone. I've been a little busy keeping you alive." A pause. He said, "Yes, I imagine you have." He looked at her again. "What is your name?" She said, "Seren Gault. The child who has been sitting at the end of that table watching you since yesterday morning is my daughter, Nell. She is 9, and she will ask you questions, and you should answer them honestly, because she will know if you don't." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The memory of one, maybe. He said, "Understood." She said, "There is broth, and there is tea, and you are not getting off that table until tomorrow at the earliest." "Those are the terms," he said, agreed. She did not entirely believe him. She believed the agreeing part. She was less certain about the tomorrow part. The card said Ashmore, and the coat said Burlington weight wool, and men who carried cards that said Ashmore in a single engraved line did not generally lie still on millinery cutting tables without chafing at it. But he ate what she brought him and did not try to get up. And in the afternoon, when Nell climbed onto the stool and examined him with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who had already decided she liked him, he answered her questions about his horse, and about what Halifax looked like from the harbour at night, and about whether Earls had to go to school, and he did it without talking down to her, which Seren noted from the pressing bench without appearing to. That was the first thing she noticed, besides the coat. That evening, after Nell had gone up, he said into the quiet of the workroom, "I had a brother. His name was Piers. He died 2 years ago. They said it was his heart." She was threading a needle at the lamp. She did not look up. She said, "You don't think it was his heart?" He said, "I think it was his heart. I think someone helped it along." She set the needle down. He said, "I am the 5th Earl of Ashmore because my brother died without issue, and the title came to me. My brother was the 4th. He was supposed to marry a woman called Vivienne Colquhoun. He broke the engagement 6 weeks before he died. He left a letter. The letter reached me in Aberdeen, where I was working with a surveying party, 2 months after the funeral. It said that he had discovered something about Miss Colquhoun that made the marriage impossible. It did not say what. I came home. I went through his papers. I found 3 letters in her hand in the drawer of his writing desk. I took them to my solicitor. My solicitor told me they were not sufficient. 3 weeks ago I received a social invitation to dinner at the Colquhoun House on South Park Street here in Halifax, where the family has been since September. I attended. I had a single glass of bourbon. That is the last thing I remember before your alley. The workroom was quiet. Outside the harbour fog had come in again, the way it came in every November evening, and the lamplight made the room smaller than it was. She said, "What was in the letters?" He said, "Financial arrangements." She had been moving money out of the Ashmore estate accounts through a Halifax trading firm for 14 months before Piers died. The amounts were not large individually. Together they came to something close to £11,000. Seren sat with that for a moment. She said, "And your solicitor said 3 letters weren't sufficient." He said, "My solicitor said I would need a witness to the transactions themselves, or a confession, or a second set of documentation from the trading firm's own records." He said the letters could be disputed. He said the name on the firm's accounts was a variant spelling that Miss Colquhoun's solicitor would certainly contest. She said, "What is the name of the trading firm?" He said, "Cleves and Rowe. They operate out of Water Street." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I buy my millinery wire through Cleves and Rowe. I have done for 6 years. I know the shipping clerk." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not saying it will come to anything. I'm saying I know the door." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because you were left in my alley with chloral in your flask, and my daughter found you on the cutting table when she came down for breakfast. And I would like to know that whoever arranged the flask is not going to arrange something else in the alley outside the shop where my daughter sleeps." He looked at her. He said, "That is a fair reason." She said, "It's the only reason I have. Get some sleep. I'll go to Water Street in the morning." She went to Water Street in the morning. She had an order to place. She had been going to place it the following week, but there was no reason it could not be placed now, in person, at the clerk's window, with the conversation that sometimes happened when an account was paid promptly and in full, and the clerk knew your name and the name of your shop. The shipping clerk was a man of 40 named Brodie, red-faced and capable, and he had handled Seren's accounts for 3 years and considered her a reliable customer. She placed her order. She paid the outstanding balance on the previous one. She asked, as she had asked once or twice before, when there was a delay in a shipment, whether there had been any trouble recently with the autumn inventory. Brodie said there had been some irregularities in the autumn books that the partners were still sorting out. She said, in the way of someone making conversation while putting her receipt away, that she'd heard the Colquhoun family were back in Halifax for the season. Brodie said yes, Miss Vivian had been in only last week about the Ashmore account. She did not change her expression. She put her receipt in her coat pocket. She said that she didn't know the Colquhouns personally, but she'd always heard they were a very well-organised family. Brodie said that Miss Vivian was organised, certainly, though the partners had had some questions about how the Ashmore withdrawals had been processed under the old clerk, who had left the firm in August. He said it the way men said things when they were not sure whether they were saying too much, which meant he was saying enough. She thanked him and went back to Elgin Street. She told the Earl what Brodie had said. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The old clerk," she said, "the one who left in August." He said, "Piers died in June." She nodded, she said, "I can find out the clerk's name. I have a friend who does the books for 2 of the Granville Street merchants. She knows who moves in and out of Water Street," he said. "You have a great many useful connections for a milliner," she said. "I have been the only person supporting this business and this child for 4 years. You get useful connections or you get behind on the rent, and I have never been behind on the rent." He looked at her steadily. He said, "No, I imagine you haven't." She found out the clerk's name that afternoon. It was Fordyce Lamb, and he had left Cleves and Row in August, with a reference and a letter of introduction, and had taken a position with a shipping firm in St. John that turned out, when her friend made a careful inquiry through a contact there, to have no record of employing anyone by that name. She sent a note to the Earl's solicitor in Halifax, a man named Greg on Hollis Street, whose name she had gotten from the Earl that morning. She did not sign it with her own name. She signed it with the shop name, Gault Millinery, Elgin Street, and she asked whether Greg might be able to find where Fordyce Lamb had gone in August with his letter of introduction and his intimate knowledge of the Ashmore withdrawals from the Cleves and Row books. Greg's clerk came to the Elgin Street back door the next morning. He was a young man, perhaps 22, with a careful expression and a letter in his coat. The letter said that Greg had a contact in St. John who could inquire discreetly, and that Greg had himself been troubled by several aspects of the Ashmore estate accounts for the past 14 months, and that if Mrs. Gault had reason to believe the firm's former clerk was reachable, Greg would very much like to know where. She wrote back, "Find the clerk," 3 days later with the Earl still in the workroom, sitting up now, eating properly, answering Nell's questions about surveying and about what Aberdeen looked like in the snow, and quietly going through the papers his solicitor had sent over by the same discreet route. The name came back. Fordyce Lamb was in Truro, Nova Scotia. He was staying at a boarding house on Prince Street under the name Lamond. He had, according to Greg's St. John contact, a packet of letters in a locked box under his bed that he had told the landlady were his late wife's correspondence, which the landlady thought odd because she had the impression he had never been married. Seren laid Greg's letter on the pressing bench and read it twice. Then she went to the cutting table where the Earl was working through the estate correspondence, and she set the letter in front of him. He read it. He looked up. He said, "2," she said. "Greg's contact can get to the boarding house before Lamb knows anyone's looking. If the letters are in Vivian Colquhoun's hand, that's the second set of documentation your solicitor said you needed," he said. "It will take her solicitor 4 hours to claim the box was planted," she said. "Not if there's a sworn deposition from the landlady about when the box arrived and what Lamb said about it. And not if Brodie at Cleves and Row is willing to confirm that the withdrawals were processed under Lamb's hand, and that Miss Colquhoun was in the office last week, asking about them." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Brodie said she was asking about them." He said she'd been in about the Ashmore account. He said it in the way people say things when they want someone to hear it. I think Brodie is uncomfortable, and has been uncomfortable for some time, and would welcome the opportunity to be uncomfortable in front of a magistrate, instead of behind a counting-house window. The Earl was quiet. Then he said, "You've been doing this for 4 days." She said, "I've been running a business for 11 years. It's mostly the same." He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "My brother broke the engagement because of the money." She said, "Almost certainly." He said, he knew about the withdrawals and he confronted her, and she decided that a dead Earl was safer than a broken engagement that could be explained. She said, "And then the title came to you, and you came back with his letters." And she decided the same arithmetic applied. He put the papers down on the cutting table. He looked at the lamp. He said, "He told me once that she was everything he'd ever expected a woman of her position to be." He said it in the way people say things when they mean the opposite and don't yet know it. Seren said nothing. She had been a second wife in her own way, not literally, but the shop had come second, and Nell had come second, and the years she had spent, proving that she could do what she had said she could do, had all come second to the doubt of people who had known her when she was a constable's daughter from the North End, and had expected her to stay that way. She knew something about what people said in the way that meant the opposite. She said, "Greg should move quickly. If she knows the flask didn't work, she'll go to Truro herself." He said, "Yes." He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. We still need Brodie." She went to Brodie the next morning with a hat order she had been saving for the Barrington Street spring inventory. The kind of order that represented 3 weeks of work and a quantity of French ribbon she had to ship in from Montreal. She placed it at his window and paid a deposit. And while he was writing the receipt, she said, quietly and without preamble, that she understood there had been some concern about the Ashmore withdrawals from the autumn books, and that she had reason to believe a magistrate might be asking about those same withdrawals within the week. Brodie put the pen down. She said, "If someone were to come forward now, before that conversation, with a clear account of how the withdrawals were processed and what instructions were given, that's a different position to be in than being called to account for it afterward." Brodie looked at his hands for a moment. He was not a bad man. She had always thought he was not a bad man. She had simply thought he was a man who had worked in a firm for long enough that he had learned to look away from certain things, the way people in certain positions learn to do. He said, "The instructions came in writing." Miss Colquhoun's hand. "I have them in the firm's file," she said. "Then you should take them to Greg on Hollis Street tomorrow morning." He did. Greg's contact in Truro reached Fordyce Lamb on the Thursday evening. Lamb, who had been drinking steadily since August, and who had reportedly told the boarding house landlady 3 days earlier that he was afraid someone was going to find him, surrendered the locked box without argument when Greg's contact explained that the Earl of Ashmore was alive and in Halifax, and that the alternative to voluntary cooperation was a constable from the county. The box contained 47 letters in Vivian Colquhoun's hand, dating from January of the year before Piers Devereux died to the month of his death. The last letter, dated 4 days before Piers died, instructed Lamb to transfer a final sum and to ensure that the account records for the Ashmore withdrawals reflected a variance in spelling that would make attribution difficult. It was signed with her full name in a clear and practiced hand, the way someone signed a letter when they had not yet understood that clarity could be evidence. Greg sent a note to the cutting table on Elgin Street that said only, 5. The Earl read it. He put the note on the cutting table. He looked at the ceiling of the millinery workroom for a long time. Nell, who was on the stool at the far end doing her arithmetic, looked up from her slate and said, "What does 5 mean?" he said. "It means it's enough." Nell nodded, as if this were a satisfying number, and went back to her arithmetic. Seren was at the pressing bench. She did not say anything. She was thinking about what happened next, and what happened next was not something she was looking forward to, though she had known since the first night that it was coming. She said, "She knows you're alive by now." "If she doesn't, she will by tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. "And she knows where the alley is." He said, "Yes." He looked at her. He said, "I'm not going to leave you and Nell in this building tonight." She said, "I have a business to run and a child to put to bed, and I'm not." He said, "The magistrate's office is on Argyle Street. Greg can have the deposition chain on the table by tomorrow morning. The hearing can be the day after that at the latest. Between tonight and then, I would like you and Nell to not be on Elgin Street." She looked at him. He said, "I have a house on Dresden Row. My housekeeper is Mrs. Laval. She has been with the family for 20 years, and she will have rooms ready within the hour if I send word. There is a garden that Nell could go into in the morning, and there is a kitchen that Mrs. Laval runs on the premise that anyone in the house at mealtimes gets fed, regardless of whether they were expected. Seren was quiet for a moment. He said, "I am asking it for safety. I'm not asking it as any other thing." She said, "I know what you're asking it for." She thought about the alley. She thought about the sound the fog made when it came off the harbour at night, the particular wet silence of it. She thought about Nell asleep upstairs, while two men had stood in the street below on Tuesday night, and one of them had not looked back. She said, "One night," he said, "one night." She packed a bag for Nell and a bag for herself, and she left the millinery locked, and the lamp turned low on the pressing bench because she always left it that way. It was how the shop looked when she was gone. And she and Nell walked with the Earl down Elgin Street and up Spring Garden Road to Dresden Row, while the November fog thickened around the gas lamps, and Nell asked the Earl whether his house had a piano, which it did, and whether she could play it, and whether the housekeeper made porridge with cream, which Mrs. Laval confirmed upon their arrival, was a matter of personal honour. Seren sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Laval and a cup of tea while Nell played 4 bars of a song she half knew in the next room, and the Earl sat in the parlour going through Greg's deposition draft with a pen and his reading spectacles, which Seren had not known about until that moment, and which she did not remark upon, though she noted them. Mrs. Laval said over her tea, "He hasn't sat in that parlour since he came home from Aberdeen." Seren said, "He came back for his brother." Mrs. Laval said, "He came back to do what Piers wasn't given time to do." She looked at Seren over her cup. She said, "He's not easy company. He was an easier man before Piers died. But he's an honest one. He was always that." Seren said, "I can see that." Mrs. Laval said, "And you're an honest woman. I can see that too." In the next room, Nell played the 4 bars again, and this time she got them right. 2 men came to the Elgin Street alley at midnight. The constable Greg had posted at the back of the building, waited until they had tried the door twice, and then he stepped out of the dye house doorway and identified himself. And they ran, and he ran after them, and he had them both at the Barrington Street corner, before they reached the bottom of the hill. One of them had a letter in his coat from Vivienne Colquhoun's address on South Park Street, with instructions that Greg's constable read by his lantern in the November cold, and then folded and put in his breast pocket, with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was holding. In the morning, Greg went to South Park Street with 2 constables and a warrant. Vivienne Colquhoun received them in the front drawing-room, in a grey morning dress with a composed expression, and the manner of a woman who had been expecting something, but not quite this. She had come to Halifax in September, believing the Earl was going to be manageable. She had come to the dinner on South Park Street, believing the flask would be the end of it. She had spent the 10 days since believing that what had not worked in the alley could be arranged more quietly, if there was time. There was not time. The deposition chain went to the magistrate's table on the Friday morning. Greg had laid it out in order. Brodie's written instructions in Vivienne Colquhoun's hand, the 47 letters from the locked box in Truro, Lamb's sworn statement, the boarding house landlady's deposition about the box, and the date of its arrival, the letter found on the man in the alley, the constable's account of Tuesday night, and the Earl's own statement about the dinner on South Park Street, and the flask and the alley behind the millinery on Elgin Street. And Seren's. Greg had asked for it the day before. He had asked it carefully, in the way solicitors asked for things, when they were not certain of the reception. He had said that the chain of witness ran through the millinery, and that the account of what had been found in the alley, and what had been identified in the flask, and how the inquiry at Water Street had been conducted, was material to the case, and that without Vivienne Colquhoun's solicitor would argue that the Earl's account was uncorroborated. Seren had said, "I know." Greg had said, "There will be an objection on grounds of your standing as a tradeswoman." Seren had said, "There usually is." She had given the statement at Greg's office on the Thursday afternoon. She gave it the way she did most things, plainly and in order, without embellishment and without apology. She said what she had seen from the workroom window. She said what she had found in the alley. She said what she had smelled on the flask. She said what Brodie had said at the clerk's window and how she had understood it. She said what her friend's inquiry had found in St. John and what Greg's contact had found in Truro. She said it all in one clear connected account and signed it at the bottom in the same hand she used to invoice the Barrington Street families. The hearing was on the Friday. The magistrate was Sir Elliot Murdoch, who had been on the Halifax bench for 19 years, and who had, Greg said, seen enough of the Barrington Street families to be unimpressed by their solicitors. Vivian Colquhoun was in the courtroom, in a dark blue morning dress with her own solicitor, and a composed expression that did not change when the deposition chain was laid on the table. She had not looked at the Earl when he came in. She looked at the magistrate's bench with the expression of someone who had decided, very recently, that her best option was patience. She was still composing herself into patience when the 47 letters were read into the record. Her solicitor stood when the last one was finished. He said that the court should note that the primary source of the investigative chain was a milliner of no professional standing in matters of law or finance, and that the clerk's deposition had been given under circumstances of obvious duress, and that the letters themselves had been found in a locked box in another man's possession and could not be authenticated on the current record. Sir Elliot Murdoch looked at Seren. Seren stood. She did not have notes. She said, "I found a man drugged in my alley, and I did not want him to die in the November cold, and I had a daughter asleep upstairs, and I needed to know who had arranged the alley, so I could make sure they didn't arrange something else. I asked the questions I knew how to ask through the doors I knew how to open, and 4 people answered. You have their answers on that table." She sat down. Sir Elliot Murdoch looked at Vivienne Colquhoun's solicitor. Sir Elliot Murdoch said, "The witness's account is admitted. The letters are admitted. The depositions are admitted." He looked at his papers. He said that Vivienne Colquhoun was remanded in custody on charges of the wilful murder of Piers Devereux, 4th Earl of Ashmore. By means to be determined at trial, the attempted murder of Callum Devereux, 5th Earl of Ashmore, on the night of the 18th of November, and the fraudulent removal of approximately £11,000 from the Ashmore estate accounts, facilitated through Cleves and Row of Water Street, Halifax, over a period of 14 months. He committed the matter to the Superior Court for the winter sessions and rows. The constable went to the gallery. Vivienne Colquhoun did not look at the Earl. She did not look at Seren. She allowed herself to be taken out of the courtroom by the constable's arm at her elbow, with the same composed expression she had worn throughout, and the door closed behind her, and the courtroom began to empty. Seren sat on the front bench with Nell on her knee, because Nell had been in school for most of the morning and had arrived at the last possible moment, with her coat half-buttoned and her hair escaping its plait, and had wedged herself between her mother and the Earl's solicitor on the bench, and watched the proceedings with the focused attention she gave to things she was not sure she understood, but intended to. The Earl was on Seren's right. He had not said anything since his own account had been read. He sat now with his hands on his knees and looked at the empty magistrate's bench, and the signet on his right hand caught the winter light through the high windows. After a long while he said, "Piers," she said. "Yes," he said. He said in the letter that he'd found something that made the marriage impossible. I thought he meant something about her character. Some cruelty or some dishonesty he'd observed. She said, "He meant the accounts." He said, "He meant that the woman he was going to marry had been stealing from his family for over a year and had been so methodical about it that she'd almost gotten away with it." He was quiet. He said, "He was trying to protect me in the letter." He didn't name it clearly because he was still angry enough that the clear version would have been too ugly to write. He said, "Make of it what you will." I made of it what I expected, not what he meant. Nell, on Seren's knee, had stopped watching the bench and was watching the Earl's face instead, with the steady attention she gave to adults who were feeling something that she recognised but could not name yet. Seren said, "You came back. You did what you came to do." He said, "I came back because he deserved someone to come back." He looked at his hands. He said, "That's the whole of it." The courtroom was nearly empty. The winter light had gone flat and grey and very cold-looking through the high windows. He said, "I am going home to Dresden Row." Mrs. Laval will have made something that requires more than 2 people to eat, and there is no sensible reason to waste it. I would like you and Nell to come for dinner. After dinner, I will take you back to Elgin Street if you would prefer to sleep in your own building, and you will have a constable at the back gate for the next month, which Greg assures me is standard procedure. Or you will stay on Dresden Row in the rooms Mrs. Laval has made up, for as long as suits you. Both are correct. Neither one is a condition of anything else, Nell said from Seren's knee. Is there porridge tomorrow? The Earl said. Every morning, according to Mrs. Laval. Nell said. With cream? He said. It is a matter of personal honour. Nell looked at her mother. Seren looked at him for a moment. She thought about the millinery, which would be there in the morning, because she had locked it properly and left the lamp how she always left it. She thought about the cutting table and the pressing bench and the brim wire she had been working on before all of this had started. She thought about Nell's 4 bars of the song she half knew, played right the second time. She thought about what Mrs. Laval had said in the kitchen. He's an honest one. He was always that. She said, We'll come for dinner. He said, Good. They walked back along Spring Garden Road in the November cold, the 3 of them, and Nell held the Earl's left hand without asking, and swung it slightly, which he permitted with the expression of a man who had decided not to remark on it. And the gas lamps came on one by one as they went. 14 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in January, the millinery on Elgin Street was running at double the volume it had managed in any previous year, because Seren had taken on 2 apprentices in the spring, and the Barrington Street spring orders had come in early, and the Montreal ribbon had arrived without delay, for the first time in her experience. The shop imprint on the invoice paper she had printed in October read Gault and Devereux, Milliners, established 1883, because the Earl had asked in the summer whether he might add his name to the door, and she had said he could add it to the invoice paper, and the door could wait until she had decided how she felt about the door, and he had said that was entirely reasonable, and had not mentioned the door again. He came to the shop on Thursday afternoons. He came in through the back because the alley was where he had started, and he said he found the symmetry logical. He sat on the cutting stool and read correspondence and did not get in the way. And occasionally Nell, who was now 10 and had strong opinions about hat construction, would climb onto his knee and show him what she was working on, and he would look at it with the same serious attention he gave to surveying calculations, which Nell considered appropriate. Piers Devereux had a new stone at the churchyard in the county, because the Earl had arranged it in the spring. It said, plainly, what a stone should say, the name, the years, and below them, in a smaller line, the one the Earl had chosen himself. He knew what it was worth. Fordyce Lamb had given full evidence at the winter sessions, and had been sentenced to 7 years, and had served his first winter in the county jail with the particular grimness of a man who understood that he had made the wrong choice at every available opportunity. Vivian Colquhoun had been tried on all 3 charges in February. The jury had been out for 40 minutes. She had been sentenced to transportation and had sailed from Halifax in the April on a vessel whose name Seren did not learn and did not try to. The 2 apprentices were at the front bench on Thursday afternoons. One was 17 and fast, and the other was 15 and precise, and together they managed more volume than Seren had managed alone. Which was the point. The November orders were done, and the January orders were half done, and the shop was warm from the pressing stove, and smelled of buckram to unsteam, and the faint vanilla of the hat sizing. Nell was at the back work table, with a piece of grosgrain ribbon and a buckram frame, and a lesson she had given herself, because she was 10, and had decided that making hats was what she was going to do, and saw no reason to delay. She worked with the same steady attention she had given to the man on the cutting table, and to the piano 4 bars at a time, and to the proceedings at the magistrate's court in her half-buttoned coat. The Earl came through the back door at 2:30, and sat on the stool and picked up the letters he had left there the previous Thursday, and after a while he said, without looking up, "There's a letter from the surveying firm in Aberdeen." Seren was at the pressing bench. She said, "Are you going back?" he said. "They want me to lead the spring survey, 6 weeks, starting in April." She said, "You should go." He said, "I'll go if you'll tell me what I'm coming back to." She looked up from the pressing bench. He was looking at her over his reading spectacles, with the expression she had come to know, which was the expression of a man asking a question he had already asked in every possible way except directly, and had decided that directly was overdue. She said, "You're coming back to the shop and the apprentices and Nell's hat lesson and Thursday afternoons." He said, "And?" She thought about the door. She thought about the invoice paper that said Gault and Devereux, and the door that said only Gault. She thought about Mrs. Laval's kitchen and the porridge with cream and the 4 bars of the song played right the second time. She thought about the alley and about the way she had counted to 30 before she moved, the way her father had told her to. She said, "And the door." He looked at her. He said, "The door," she said. "You can put your name on the door when you get back from Aberdeen." He took his spectacles off and set them on the cutting table. He said, "That seems like a reasonable arrangement." She said, "It is." He put the Aberdeen letter down. He said after a moment, "Seren." She said, "Yes." He said, "It's not after Piers anymore." She understood what he meant. She had been living inside a version of after, since the morning her husband had died, and left her with a 7-month-old, and a shop she had not yet finished building. And she had lived inside it competently, because she was a woman who did things competently, but she had lived inside it all the same. She said, "No, not after," he said. From here, Nell, at the back work table, had been listening the way she always listened, which was with her eyes on her work and her ears on the room. She did not look up. She straightened the grosgrain ribbon on the buckram frame, pulled it once at the corner to true the line, and went on with what she was doing. The pressing stove ticked. The apprentices worked at the front bench. The winter light came through the Elgin Street window and lay in a long rectangle across the cutting table floor. Outside, the sign above the millinery door said only Gault. And in April it would say something more, and that was enough to know for a Thursday afternoon in January, when the shop was warm and the orders were half done, and the person she was building something with had just agreed to come back from Aberdeen. Not after. From here,